major development, the European Union has struck a deal with Israel to expand humanitarian aid access into Gaza. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas announced the agreement on Thursday today, saying it will see more food and aid trucks enter the territory, along with the opening of new crossing points. Kallas confirmed that the deal also includes the repair of critical infrastructure and improved protection for aid workers. She stressed that these measures are expected to be implemented in the coming days, with the shared understanding that large-scale aid must reach Gaza's civilian population directly. The announcement comes as over 2 million Palestinians in Gaza face catastrophic humanitarian conditions due to restricted aid during Israel's ongoing war with Hamas. The EU says it will coordinate closely with UN agencies and NGOs to ensure swift delivery of support. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Daniel. Daniel Roth, he's a researcher and director at United Against Nuclear Iran. Thank you, Daniel, for staying with us. How big of a breakthrough is this that EU-Israel deal for improving aid access into Gaza is coming maybe into practice soon?
Yes, I think it's good news for the civilians of Gaza. Key land corridors are going to be reopened from Egypt and from Jordan. I believe that food supplies will be significantly boosted. That's going to give a good lifeline to the Gazan civilians. However, I think a note of caution, having read the EU statement itself, it's really still putting all the pressure, all the blame on Israel. I think the quote was, "We expect Israel to implement these measures." Well, that's easy to say, and I'm sure Israel is doing everything it can to do so. However, there's no mention of really the big obstacle, which, as I mentioned previously, is Hamas. Hamas has an interest in preventing aid getting to Gazan civilians. It's excellent propaganda for that terrorist operation, for that terrorist organization, I should say. As I said, they divert aid systematically, even the United Nations. Every single day, a lot of reporters ask about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Every day, the UN spokesman says, lorries were diverted. In one instance, I remember seeing 98 trucks were looted by Hamas or associated criminal gangs. So really, I would really like to see the European Union, as well as the United Nations, just be truthful about what the underlying issue is. And although Israel has responsibility, it really must direct that pressure on Hamas and to explain to reporters and to the wider world that it's really Hamas that is responsible for the suffering in Gaza for those civilians. But today's development is a good start, I think.
You've already kind of mentioned it, but what do you think what challenges, as well as, Hamas is a challenge, could delay the opening of new crossing points and infrastructure repairs and aid crossing into or passing to the people in Gaza? This
Well, I think it's important to note the traditional, historic method of delivering aid has been through UNRWA. This is the United Nations Agency for Palestine, Relief Works Agency. Since about May, so for the past few months, there's now been an alternative mechanism for getting aid into Gaza, and that's the US State Department funded initiative called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The GHF tries or is attempting to address this issue that we talked about, this issue of Hamas diverting and looting all this aid. So they have a different way of distributing the aid. They will go to spots, locations more outside the camps, outside the cities, where the aid can go directly to the civilians who do indeed have to line up in those queues that we see on the TV. What's been really interesting, though, is how the United Nations and to an extent the European nations have reacted to the GHF initiative. They have been incredibly critical, and I think it's been very revealing about the politicization of aid generally into Gaza. if if I am a Gazan civilian, I don't think I'm going to care whether my aid comes from one organization or another organization. All I care about is actually getting that aid. However, the UN is incredibly critical of this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and as I say, it's quite revealing how politicized the whole thing is. I think the GHF is doing a pretty good job under the circumstances, but I think it's important to note this alternative mechanism as well.
Yes, indeed. And how do you think, how will the EU ensure that large-scale aid actually reaches those civilians and not armed groups like Hamas?
Well, the EU doesn't really have any say at all, and that's why in that statement they issued today, they assign all responsibility to Israel and Israel alone. So inevitably, once there will be civilian injuries, there will be incidents caused by Hamas, and the blame will inevitably go towards Israel. And indeed, the European Union, the European nations will blame Israel. So Israel really is in a no-win situation when it comes to delivering aid. But in terms of your specific question, there's really nothing that the EU can do apart from what I would suggest would be a better route, would be to actually point the blame at Hamas and do it clearly and understand that Israel is trying its best under very trying circumstances.
And Daniel, you mentioned EU maybe will rely on Israel for that, but what role will UN agencies and NGOs play in monitoring and distributing this expanded aid, according to you?
Well, the main agency, as I said, is UNRWA, UNRWA. They will have a big role, I think, in this new development that happened with the European Union and Israel today. As I say, they're very careful to exclude anything with alternative or rival humanitarian delivery mechanisms, which, as I say, is very interesting. But yes, they've done the job for many decades, and I'm sure they'll have a role to play in this latest development too.
And Daniel, lastly, could this agreement ease tensions between Israel and international partners who have criticized the aid restriction until now?
Yeah, I think it probably will help smooth over some of those issues. A lot of the European leaders have been critical of Israel. I think of the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez in particular, ridiculously accusing Israel of genocide, the only European leader to do so. Ultimately, I just think Israel is in a very, very difficult situation. It has no interest, absolutely no interest in harming Gazan civilians. It makes no strategic sense for Israel to do that. It's obviously terrible optics for the world. The only advantage for Gazan civilians being killed is really for Hamas, because it uses it as its own propaganda, and Hamas has been very successful. And unfortunately, European leaders, they do either fall for it unintentionally, or I think in some cases intentionally, because there is just this real anti-Israel animus that we see in major European nations and indeed the United Nations as well. So it's tricky, but I think this is a good development, and it could probably smooth over some of these difficult bilateral relations between European nations and Israel.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel. You will stay with us as we stay in this topic.